Welcome to Curious and Unqualified, a podcast about life in academia. I'm Eric Edlund, professor of physics.
I'm Jeremy Jimenez, professor in the Foundations and Social Advocacy Department. So, here we are, episode 4. What are your thoughts so far as to some of the key takeaways and things of interest from the past few weeks?
I think as a meta takeaway, it's a lot of work to do a podcast.
It is, even with our relatively little preparation for them.
Yeah, it's editing, and yes, there is editing that happens.
Mostly my ums.
Yeah, there's been a lot of ums that have been removed from these things. That right there, there's one. We'll leave that one. But in regard to the content of our show, I think there's 3 things that really come to mind at this point. And the first one is, I think it's a really interesting time to be a moderate, and I think that's one of the flavors of the show, right? We're trying to be just and fair and open-minded and to look at all sides. And ideally, in the long run, I think, talk to people from all sides. And I would even go so far as to say, I would love to interview Joe the plumber, who doesn't believe in the value of higher ed and thinks it's all a fraud and a big scheme. Right, and professors are riding the gravy train. I would love to talk to a person like that and dive into what they're thinking.
Yeah, I mean, it's such a polarizing time that, like, one of the things we were talking about when we think about topics for the show is who you're going to alienate, right? If you do anything off script from one of the teams, liberals and conservatives, like, there's a fear, oh, okay, that's off that official script, so we lost those people as listeners. It's weird to try to hear both sides is a relatively rare, it seems, thing in the mediascape today.
And I think even as we've talked about our shows so far, we've tried to take steps to kind of carefully navigate some topics. Even so far, even as little as we've done, we're starting to experience and feel the boundaries of kind of what's acceptable. So I think, it's a really interesting time to be a moderate, and I think it's an interesting time because there's so much happening to critique both sides and also be a point of contact between both sides and try to
build bridges
and bring conflicting ideas together for open discussion.
And find common ground, hopefully.
Well, perhaps. At least if you can't even find common ground, just to at least appreciate and listen to the other side. As a second point, I really enjoyed our conversation with Alex. I think there's a couple big takeaways from that. One, I've essentially lived abroad. I've done a lot of work in Germany. I know you're a huge international traveler. And I know these experiences have been transformative for us. And I was just reminded in our conversation with Alex how important that is. How often and where else in life do you get to talk to someone who's lived through an oppressive communist regime, right? You only get that through someone who has lived a different life in history, right? Who comes from a completely different place. That's of an incredible value for us thinking about our life here in the United States and our future and actively building that. Like, what do we want to have in terms of leadership, in terms of government? What do we want to have in terms of civic engagement? What do we want to have in terms of conversation with each other? And I think, in addition to meeting Alex, one of the benefits and great privileges of working at a university is that we get exposed to international guests.
And well, that's because what we're seeing happening all across the country now is people getting visas revoked from visiting, people getting deported, people getting detained at the border, a lot of academics, people giving talks and having their slides examined previously for prior approval, like it happened in New York University. So this is a wonderful place where we are now, and I think all the more reason why we need to stand up and fight for this, because it's something we can't take for granted, because it's something we are slowly losing and could lose a lot further.
Absolutely, and that is, in essence, one of the spirits of this show, and I think some people might ask why we're doing this now. Like, shouldn't it be better just to be quiet and keep our heads down? And I think you and I both agree that, no, this is exactly the time when we need to be practicing and exercising our right to free speech, even if it pisses a few people off on the way.
And, I think back to when I talk about racism in class, that like 5-6 years ago, students would make, not racist comments, but they would challenge things like
insensitive comments, maybe.
Or just like say things like about affirmative action. Affirmative action just seems unfair to me. And then since George Floyd, I haven't heard those comments. And it was easy for me to lull myself into thinking, since George Floyd, the average student is just kind of more aware of it. But I think what's probably happened is, and especially when you can see how many young people voted for Trump, I think a lot of more people are just censoring themselves, right? I don't know if there has been that much of a shift between attitudes about things like affirmative action 5 years ago from today. But I've even noticed that dynamic in the classroom where there's just students are much more censoring themselves on a lot of these topics. topics and trying to just say the acceptable thing they think they're not going to get in trouble for than some students who are willing to take those risks even 5 years ago.
I think this is one of the short-sighted strategies kind of the left, and I think of academia, and maybe it's not exactly a strategy, but a cultural attribute of academia, is that there hasn't been great tolerance for dissenting ideas in many areas. And you're right, people are self-censoring. Certainly, students are, faculty, of course, are. I mean, there's been any number of kind of controversial ideas I've heard in private conversations that people wouldn't dare speak on campus in an open forum.
And I remember at Stanford talking to climate scientists, right? There was such a wide gap between what their presentation was about and then what they're willing to say with you when you had to be with them at the bar, like later on the night, right? So yeah, so even in like things which don't seem as controversial, it's like putting your reputation about what you think are how dire are predictions for climate change, even things like that. A lot of scientists are censoring themselves.
I think that's short-sighted because those ideas, if they're suppressed or self-censored, they don't go away. They just kind of remain dormant. Right, just like a seed in the ground, and it crops up when the climate warms and is more favorable for them.
Or possibly worse, maybe not so much for climate change, but for a lot of topics is people retreat to the echo chambers, right? And algorithms reinforce that so that you do say the ideas, but you don't get to say ideas with people who might be able to challenge you. You're kind of technologically filtered into people that are just going to agree with you because that's going to increase your engagement.
Reminds me, sunlight is the best disinfectant. We need more conversations. We need more difficult conversations. And I think we've fallen out of practice of that in academia. And that brings me kind of to my third point, also from our conversation with Alex. I thought it was incredible to hear his story of his youth in Romania and the incredible amount of self-censorship and paranoia they lived under about saying the wrong thing to the wrong person. I think that really reflects the climate that we live in today, especially in the current climate right now. There's a lot of fear, especially by people on the left, of saying the wrong thing and getting targeted by the right.
So let's deep dive into this. We'll start with what's rightfully being discussed a lot at the moment. Students being expelled and deported or encouraged to self-deport for criticizing Israelis' assaults on Gaza. And I'll go on record calling it a genocide with Netanyahu as the chief perpetrator. But this episode isn't a debate about what's happening in Gaza, but about whether or not students, faculty, and staff have the right to discuss Gaza or anything freely. It's interesting. A while back, I did a Fulbright summer research project in Swaziland, now called Eswatini. And I remember faculty back then being surprisingly open and critical about their king. And when I told them I was surprised at this, they told me, well, it's only because we're only telling you this because we're on campus, sort of implying the university campus is a special zone for critique. It's kind of like Singapore's Speaker's Corner, where open debate and protests are permitted in this one place in Singapore. And while our country's universities don't have the same status as the only safe space to criticize your government, the tenure that many faculty have historically been offered is in part to encourage faculty to speak freely without fear of job loss. Though interestingly, as professors retire and increasingly aren't replaced with tenure-track positions, while this is done primarily to save money in the long run, it actually reduces the percentage of instructors over time who have this tenure and thus freedom to speak freely. But what's happening in many universities, especially those highly dependent on federal research grants, is they're caving into the Trump administration's demands to identify students who attend protests, wrote op-eds, and in some cases just liking tweets or other social media posts that were speaking out against the genocide, with such legitimate protests being incorrectly labeled as pro-Hamas, pro-terrorism, or anti-Semitic. Now, notably, there are some exceptions. I think Tufts was willing to go to court for one of their students that was unjustly detained. There's Rutgers Senate voted to initiate a mutual defense compact, starting with their own fellow Big Ten schools. But I fear the default may be more of a climate of fear, of professors and admins encouraging each other to keep your head down and stay quiet so as not to alert Trump's minions to target the funding of one individual school or one's vulnerable foreign students that might be here on visa.
You know, I can't say I've studied the issue of the protests and the deportations relating to students and faculty members who have attended protests in any deep way. One question I have, and maybe you know the answer to this, is I think it's one thing to protest the war and to protest the killing of civilians. And I think it's another thing, and I think these two things get mixed up, is to also be kind of pro-Hamas, because Hamas is technically labeled as a terrorist organization.
Right, but I think what's happening now is a lot of students are being called as advocating Hamas because, taking a very simplistic binary argument, well, if you're criticizing Israel's response to October 7th, therefore you must be sympathetic with the ruling regime in Gaza. And so while I'm sure there are specific students that are pro-Hamas and they might say things are pro-Hamas, I highly doubt that the average Gaza protesters would put themselves in the pro-Hamas camp, but I think they're getting painted as such so that it's easier to kind of shut down these protests from taking place.
I think you're right. And there's a conflation of these things. And that's something that happens all too common in many discussions where you take one person's ideas and you conflate it with the most extreme radical idea. That being said, I think there's ground for debate there.
But the bigger issue is that because of the stakes being raised to what can happen if you are associated with that, is there's just a lot of self-censorship happening.
Absolutely.
And it's not what professors calling happening in Gaza means that professor will automatically be fired, at least not yet. It's more that this could entail students, faculty, admin, academic departments, grants programs getting targeted for arrests, deportations of non-citizens, grant funding lost, online trolls unleashed to go after the offending faculty or students. And so here we are, we're at that famous, first they came for the communists, but I wasn't a communist, so I didn't say anything. But I don't think it's a simple story of bravery versus cowardice. It's about being selective when, where, and how to word your critiques, to balance speaking out against injustice versus not putting students, colleagues with less rights, i.e. non-citizens, at more risk, and choosing your battles, and how you want to spend your free speech capital. If you lose your position for speaking out, as some have, you then lose your platform status to be able to critique more effectively. And, technology is a double-edged sword. Online posts can have more reach, but they also enable you to be put on record as a dissident. Sound bites will be more easily shared and make headlines, but this means it's harder to make points in context, meaning you can easily be misquoted or misinterpreted, whether unintentionally or malevolently. And while I'm on sabbatical this year, so I have yet to know emotionally and practically the self-censorship pressure will impact my teaching, I've heard from many colleagues at my own and other institutions that are starting to watch what they say and thinking about what's the safest way to not say the wrong thing. Just stop talking about a topic, which again, we professors have a lot of leeway in choosing what ideas, topics to raise in class, so the censorship pressure probably means a lot more professors might be opting out of discussing Gaza altogether, which, of course, makes it easier for a psychopath like Netanyahu to more easily pursue his crimes.
I remember hearing secondhand. It was about kind of student concerns and feeling like microaggressions. When do they feel attacked in class, and how should you respond to that? Actually, were you at this thing maybe where somebody asked the question, like, what if I say, talk about Israel and a student says, I feel threatened by Israel? The response was, well, then that student may have a valid complaint. And this is something that was actively being discussed on campus. I mean, how chilling is that? That there was a concern that even mentioning the name of a country might lead to a feeling of a threat that could then have ramifications for an instructor.
I just talked about all the current attacks from Trump and the right, but yeah, it's also worth commenting on the cancel culture from the left. Now, I want to be clear, I don't want to draw a false equivalency between real-world consequences. It's one thing to have a speaking engagement canceled by a protesting student. It's a more concerning development to me to be detained and deported for expressing nonviolent opinions. That being said, I do think that they feed each other. Whenever one side doesn't allow the other side to share their perspective, it leads to greater polarization, mistrust, retreat into algorithmic echo chambers, and often eventually dehumanization. And with regard to this polarization, I'm going to indict both liberals and conservatives with two historical examples. First, on the conservative front. After the September 11 attacks, which hits home for me, given that the Twin Towers are visible to me just about a few minutes bike ride from my childhood home in Hudson County, on the extreme end, you had dehumanizing rhetoric about Muslims by neighbors, students, talk radio hate mongers, saying things like, we need to deport them all, a few nukes will flatten the Mideast for good, only good Muslim is a dead Muslim, etc. And I was appalled by how many more Americans completely accepted the Patriot Act and all its police state provisions. I think actually a lot of what we're seeing today as we descend into more overt fascism had its foundation built on those Patriot Act provisions. Suddenly, the supposedly freedom-loving Republican Party was all about taking away freedoms and supporting Big Brother. And for this and other reasons, I was solidly on Team Liberal. Fear's no way to live. Don't let your emotions overtake your reasoning. Have some empathy. Speak out against injustice and the burgeoning surveillance state. In short, my fellow liberals were the bulwark against fear and prejudice. Now, fast forward to spring 2020. All of a sudden, what I thought were my anti-surveillance team seemed to have little qualms about all the new COVID tracking mechanisms set up. Those who rightfully spoke out against the Muslim ban in Trump's first term now thought it was fine that workers could lose their jobs and students get kicked out of school for refusing a medical intervention which was completely new and untested technology, and which, I might add, has now been shown to be not as effective as promised, and for some groups, such as young males, might actually have more risk than benefit. And with all this trust of and deference to pharmacy companies, I thought liberals were team anti-pharmaceutical industry. So dehumanizing jokes about Muslims killed in an Iraqi war strike has its extreme equivalent on team liberal gloating laughter towards people who are dying of COVID who refuse the vaccine. Fear clouding your judgment isn't the exclusive property of any political team.
Yeah, I think you said gloating is a very good word, right? When people were suffering and dying because they had refused the vaccine. And it's very tragic because underlying this is a large sense of distrust. Right? And the distrust is going both ways. And I think it's only getting worse in time, right? Like what is happening now is not helping the situation, right? I thought that the right were kind of the freedom of speech advocates. And they don't have to agree with everything that's being said by their opponents and at protests, but they should defend people's rights to speak and protest nonetheless, and especially on a university campus. And I get that there's resentment there, but it does no good to further undermine that trust and those rights.
And I remember, too, just as far as like my own censorship, I recall many times when I tried to post evidence that COVID more likely leaked from a Wuhan virology lab. And shout out to Jon Stewart for being a liberal voice of reason on that issue.
Although it's interesting that he said that about 4 years after Fox News was saying it and got all this fanfare.
Exactly.
Right?
But that's
at the time, Fox News was ridiculed. And I'm not a Fox News fan,
right,
but I just point this out as an example of the hypocrisy that exists throughout our culture.
Yeah, and it was because he was supposed to be on Team Liberal and Team Liberal wasn't supposed to express that view, he was getting canceled left and right, which was absolutely absurd because they'd be like, what he just spelled out was like very logical. Like it makes a lot of sense that it emerged when it was first found 4 blocks from the virology lab. Yeah, it probably came from the virology lab.
And a coronavirus virology lab at that.
Right? Studies corona bad viruses. But yeah, when I was trying to post about it, Facebook, YouTube, most of the main tech companies rejected most of my posts. Later, they modified their policies to just label the posts medical and misinformation. But, whether it's the recent New York Times articles or Chronicle of Higher Education articles acknowledging the likelihood of a lab leak or criticizing the disastrous policies of the lockdown or mask ineffectiveness, we're now seeing the vindication of this conservative critique. And the consequences go beyond the job losses and their lack of faith in any mainstream medical communication, right? And so that's what's kind of happened is that what's going to happen for the next pandemic that is really a pandemic that is killing many people in such higher numbers than the flu, it's going to be, you're going to have maybe up to half the country is just going to flat out reject it. And that's been one of the legacies of this. And enter, the popularity of RFK with his waffling on measles vaccines. Although, he is occasionally right, as with fluoride, which maybe we can talk about later.
All very interesting. And I think this ties back very nicely to our conversation with Alex. It was just a striking image. He and his family kind of talking behind closed doors, having a very small circle of people they trust, and secretly accessing Radio Free Europe. I feel like we're kind of entering that strange parallel universe.
And I think we as professors have to do as best the job we can to encourage ideas from being expressed with the understanding that we're all here to learn. We all should be open to having our views challenged. If, for example, a student said, Black people only get into college because of affirmative action, I would not consider it censorship if someone responded, that seems kind of racist to me because you're making a blanket prejudice statement that no Black people are good enough to get into college without support, and you're stating it with certainty. For me, calling this a racist comment, I wouldn't consider censorship, though, of course, even when identifying racism, you have to be aware of reactive attitudes, right? Saying something in such a way to actually invite someone to see the world differently rather than have them just close off and double down on their views. But we do a great disservice to anyone who might want to say, but don't you think it's unfair that some people of some racial backgrounds have more access to opportunities and scholarships than white students who might be marginalized in other ways, such as extreme poverty? If such a comment is made by a student that is genuinely committed to hearing counterpoints, if the student is afraid to get canceled for even saying this, that leads to a whole lot of self-censorship, shuts down dialogue, and no one's really benefiting from that.
Labels like racist or bigot or transphobe are thrown around so frequently now, it has a chilling effect, people being very wary of what they say. I think the other side of that, though, is that those types of labels are dropped so frequently for such minor things. I feel like it devalues the gravity of a word that should be reserved for something actually significant,
Well, and that's,
worthy of a deep debate.
and this brings me back to the value of international education. I remember there was some young teenage woman. She wore a Chinese prom dress. It was like a traditional Chinese dress prom, and she was getting canceled for cultural appropriation.
Oh, I remember this.
But then you look on the Chinese social media, and they loved it. They
Oh.
were honored by the fact that
She
she
was
wore a
promoting
dress,
it,
and she was
and
promoting
she-
exactly.
yeah.
And I think
Yeah.
like there's that assumption too that like anyone thinks they have the right to speak on behalf of like what's cultural appropriation, and instead of actually going to people of the culture and seeing what are their views on the matter, right? That would make it much more complicated.
There's that side of it, but also I think we just need to back off from just labeling people as bigots and transphobes and racists for speaking their mind. If we want to have an exchange of ideas and values, and more importantly, if you believe that certain ideas out there are wrong and you would like to try to change people's minds, the worst possible thing you can do is shut them down and quiet them by insulting them and making them fearful.
And especially now that we're seeing the exact opposite happening with anti-Semitism, right? We're having legitimate critiques of Israel's genocide against the people of Gaza and Palestinians. It's simply getting labeled anti-Semitic to even critique that, right? So it's that same
Exactly.
cancel language is now being used with even greater consequences, I think, especially with regard to people being deported. So yeah, heavy stuff.
I think we need to keep having these conversations. And like I mentioned at the beginning of the show, if anyone out there, knows Joe the plumber, let's have him on here. Let's have some interesting conversations from the other side.
That was a little bit short of an episode, but we figured it was a provocative enough topic that we'll allow a shorter length to speak for the value of what we're trying to share here. And but yeah, of course, we would love your comments about this.
I was actually surprised that there's no trolls in our comments out there.
Yeah, I
So
think as well, because at last check we had 40 subscribers, so I suspect we're still pretty below the radar.
I think that's true. Yeah. So anyway, if you know a good troll in your social network, send them our way.
No, please don't. No, I actually loved the fact that there's not many comments, but they're nice. So that's that's a nice break.
Two of
from
the four
social
comments are from you and me. So.
Oh, is that? Wait, guys, please comment. Say whatever you want, except just don't be unnecessarily mean, I guess.
All right. Well, you and I can agree to disagree on that point. Well, Jeremy, thank you. I'm looking forward to many more interesting conversations.
Yeah. Thanks, Eric.